Fancy Mercedes, go! It's easy to forget this, but the Mercedes CLS was mildly controversial when it first happened back in 2004.
Like today, right? We have so many different types of car that a manufacturer could rock up and say that it had found a market for a coupe style pickup truck, and we'd all be like, okay, whatevs, fine.
But back when this fella came out and Mercedes called it a four-door coupe, the internet went slightly mental. You can't do that, man. Everybody knows that a coupe's got two doors, you idiots.
But then when the fog of anonymous online indignation cleared, it became apparent that Mercedes was onto something. It didn't really matter what label Mercedes attached to it. The CLS was fancy and it was cool and it was practical enough, really.
But most of all, it was distinctive. It drew a reaction. It stood out, you know?
And so we fast forward to this one, the third one if you're counting, and we go straight to the main problem that I think this has.
It's gone generic, you know what I mean? Like, the front end looks almost identical to the latest A-Class. And if you made that comparison back in 2004, well, there just wasn't one to be made. And then at the back, it's just... Look, I mean, I could go on about this for a while.
The point is that when a large part of something's appeal is based on an aesthetic, especially when that aesthetic comes at the cost of practicality and makes the car cost more, you'd expect it to stand out at least, and I just don't think this does enough.
Don't get me wrong, right? On its own, it is a lovely thing. And I'm always reluctant to talk about styling because, you know, it's the ultimate subjective quality. But I do think it's justifiable here because, like I say, if you buy one of these, you are paying a high price for the way this thing looks.
For a start, it's noticeably less practical than, say, the Mercedes E-Class, the car on which it's based. And granted, I'm tall, right? But as you can probably see, my hair is scraping the roofline of this thing, and that very rarely happens these days, especially with a big car.
Although, as I'm sure some of you will be quick to point out, for some reason I did go for the "there's something about Mary" look on this particular day.
I know, it's crazy.
It doesn't happen in an Audi A7, for example, and the rear headroom is even worse.
And because it's a four-door saloon, it's just not that practical. I mean, sure, the boot is an okay size and it will be big enough for most, but it's significantly smaller than an E-Class's boot. And it's smaller than an Audi A7's boot, and unlike that particular car, this isn't a hatchback, so it loses on a huge amount of practicality and versatility on that front too. Same goes for the BMW 6 Series GT. Also a hatchback, although that particular car does sit in a niche all on its own. A niche I like to call the ugly segment. And all this compromised practicality costs a lot. Now, Mercedes has made it quite hard to compare this like for like with an E-Class because the engines and the trims don't quite line up. But the entry points look like this. And even if you match up the particular car that I'm driving now,
which happens to be the AMG one,
which you can, that extra seems a bit excessive, right?
Especially when you consider that the interiors of the CLS and the E-Class are, to all intents and purposes, the same. It is really lovely looked at in isolation. But to know that you can have this cabin, pretty much, for a good 15 grand less and in a shell that's more practical, that's definitely a thing to think about.
Still though, the CLS is one lovely place to sit, undeniably, assuming you're not too tall. It's the flourishes, you know, like when you turn the temperature up, the vents glow red, and when you turn the temperature down, the vents glow blue. And the wood trim's all matte and nice to stroke. It's all just a bit of haptic exotica, really. And this being an upper echelon Mercedes, there's no real bog or spec one. All of them are AMG line. And that means on the outside you get big wheels and stuff, and then inside you get sports seats. And most notably, you get the full twin screen panoramic instrument display setup thing that's optional on other Mercedes cars. And that almost entirely declutters the dashboard. It's amazing. The main thing to say is that you can spend extra money on a better stereo and things, but you don't really need to.
Unless you want Apple CarPlay or the Android one, in which case you have to bundle it in with a package that costs about 3.5 grand, which is just annoying.
And so finally, weirdly, how does it drive?
Okay. First of all, there are a couple of minor irritations in here. A couple of turds in the meadow of tranquility. Aside from the headroom thing, the footwell is a tiny bit on the tight side. It's kind of like the transmission tunnel, just a bit too thick. And in general, I find this particular Mercedes infotainment system just a bit counterintuitive at times. A bit fiddly, some of the sub-menus aren't that clear or easy to get to. And as well as this thing rides in general, like the body control's really good, there's always this underlying sense, quite literally, that the massive wheels are messing things up a little bit, making things a little bit juddery. Like you just want a bit more in the sidewalls just to cushion things down that little bit.
And you won't be able to get away from that, of course, because like I just said, all cars are AMG line, or they're actual AMG models.
Now I'll cut back to that because it's a bit specialist, and let's be honest, you're probably going to buy a diesel and you're probably going to just sit on the motorway in one of these for most of the time that you're in it. And in that sense, the CLS absolutely excels. It has a lovely overarching sense of refinement. So again, wheels aside, it's got a lovely soft ride quality, brilliant on the motorway, dead relaxed, hardly any noise, engine or wind, which is especially impressive given that these are coupe style frameless doors. Unless you're really holding a microscope to every aspect of this thing, it just feels like a really lovely luxury car. Sort of thing that you could sit in for 500 miles, absolutely no bother, and then and it's not really engine dependent either, because Mercedes is so good at doing diesels now that if you do get one of those, you'll barely hear the thing. And possibly even more surprisingly, that also applies to this one, the 53 AMG. Watch how it overtakes, right? Bye-bye! Now, of course, it being a proper AMG car, it has driving modes that affect virtually every element of the experience.
Suspension, steering, traction control, gear shift response, throttle response, and noise.
And so in comfort mode, you get the same basic experience as you'd get in any other CLS. Lovely, mildly wallowy tranquility. Stick it in Sport Plus though, and it's as though they've put a different engine in the front and a different exhaust system at the back. It's got a 9-speed automatic, right? Now in comfort mode, the gear changes are so smooth that they're barely perceptible. But then when you stick it in Sport Plus, it gives you this like really aggressive driveline shunt whenever it changes gear. Now it's a bit unnecessary when you're taking the kids to school, but it's like really dramatic and cool. And the whole setup, including the steering feel, which gets heavier, all gives you enough extra feel to just let you enjoy this car's obvious capabilities a bit more. This CLS is 4-wheel drive. A lot of the CLS range is now, actually. And although it never feels like a sports car, it still has that floaty luxury car feel about it. It is actually really easy to enjoy driving this thing. Feels more planted and more secure on the road than your average very powerful rear wheel drive fancy saloon does. It's pretty agile, the body control's really tight and the steering response is really quick, and there's enough weight to it in sport mode. It does give you that sense that you can push it a little bit around corners without feeling like you're going to lose it.
And so what we have here is the sort of dual character thing that many cars shoot for, but very few actually achieve. And it is more apparent in the AMG one because there's a bigger gap between the two extremes, but you get it no matter which CLS you buy. And that's the appeal of this car. Pretty good fun on one hand, very good luxury on the other. It's a sort of thing that the BMW 5 Series has been getting right for generations now, but that more recently the Audi A7 doesn't quite, even though I actually prefer the A7 because it's more practical and I think it's got a better cabin too. But only just, I'm willing to concede that point to somebody who really likes the CLS cabin.
Which brings me back to what I was saying at the start. A CLS should be one of the most beautiful, or at least the most surprising things on the road, like the first one was. But this just isn't. Like, it's lovely in many ways and it's very pretty, but I'm just not sure that overall, as a package, there's enough here to justify the price tag. It's kind of left me strangely cold.
Agreed? Let me know below. Now, if you want to know a lot more about the CLS, I'll put some links underneath the video here and you can go to the Honest John website and find out everything you want to know there. Please watch our other stuff, please hit subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thanks, bye.